Good afternoon, seventh graders. It's April 19th, Sunday. You go back to school tomorrow. So I figured I would put up a little literature lesson. I was going to read stories to you, but I figured you could read them yourself, being that you're in seventh grade. So we're moving into the Fables department of our unit. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about Fables. Um, Fables are prose, and prose is just the written or spoken language that we usually use every day. Although less commonly, they can be presented in different types of forms. Sometimes they're in poetry, but most of the time we're looking at it in just the written language. Prose in the form of fables dates back to the Anglo-French world of the 14th century. It comes from the word fibula, the Latin word fibula, meaning history, and also comes from the word fare, which means to speak. It was used by medieval troubadours, if you can believe it. And a troubadour, well, Mr. Lakin's like a troubadour prior to having a classroom. He was the traveling troubadour. And so you know that he is now in his own classroom, so he's no longer the traveling troubadour. But a troubadour is someone who plays music and tells stories. Now, some of the most famous fables along the line were Aesop's fables. Many of you have probably read those, and they're quite interesting. Now, when we look at the 10 facts or the 10 characteristics of a fable, well, the most distinctive one is the fact that every fable, the characters are usually animals. This is probably the most distinctive property of a fable, and they're almost always humanized animals, or as they would say, anthropomorphic. Is that how you say that word? Anthropomorphic, excuse me, anthropomorphic. And that means that they speak as humans and behave like humans. Um, I guess like us. Yeah, we're kind of anthropomorphic. Well, sometimes. Um, they symbolize man in society and corresponds in some measures to the type of natural behavior of animals in its habitat. So the animal's in its habitat acting like a human, but it's an animal. Okay. The second important part of a fable is the fact that it has a narrator, and usually this narrator is a narrator who is more of an observer, and they do not usually interact. They're called a non-participant observer and narrator, and this is usually done in the third person. Um, see next, usually written in very simple structure. Fables can go between 3 lines, 4 lines, to the ones that we're going to read this week are a couple pages long. So they're very simply written. The structure, there's a protagonist, there's an antagonist, and usually the conflict is usually resolved by the end, whether that conflict resolution is relevant or not. Length. Fables, like I just said, are short stories that usually tell us about a human problem, and God knows we have a lot of problems as humans. We try to present these characters in a given situation to provide the message in the most simplest and concrete way. Okay? They always have human themes, for the most part, I should say. They kind of like treat the human defect and vices through their interaction of characters. So we all have vices, and lying and cheating and stealing, and not all of us do that, but the those vices are the ones that we're talking about that we kind of make a play with fables. Fables are aimed at all different audiences across the board, from children to older adults, to adults. Very simplicity, and the fable is focused so that even little children can understand what the problem is and how it was resolved. Um, Many of the fables are also literary resources to other things. They are focused so that it contains a lot of satire. It criticizes behaviors and resort to the humanization and personification of non-human things. What are the reasons for fables? Well, they have a teaching purpose. They are to teach us lessons. They are to teach us how things should be and how we should act, and what happens when we do not act in the right manner. Is recognized on a scale of what is good and what is bad in life, depending on the culture in the collective view of that time. Um, because you could say, okay, it's bad to be on your computer all the time, but if you look at today's world, we have to be on the computer all the time. Otherwise, I can't sit here and do a little lesson for you. Um, a fable usually deals with more universal aspects of human behavior in society than it would deal with something on a one-to-one basis. So, fables, short, collective, all about behavior of humans, in contrast to the wrong and its consequences, which it usually tells us as well. They also respond to the social cultural needs of people. Um, Fable helps to maintain a structure of values in a certain collective world. It transmits the conventions of how to act, how you're expected to act, how society should be, and they do this through the narrative and the message that each fable will produce. I would really like to see if we can kind of like each create a fable and make a virtual book of fables. That's something that I will look into over the course of next week in literature, and everybody might have to write a fable, and we could put a virtual book together. That would be kind of fun. Or you could maybe we could work together and do it on Google Docs, and well, we'll see. And lastly, the most important aspect of a fable is, can you guess what it is? Yes, it is the moral. It seeks to leave a message to the reader. It wants you to be able to look back at the prose and come out after reading it with the message and how to act. It's almost always explicit and presented at the end of the story in a small sentence outside the narrative. So once you see the paragraph, usually uh, after skipping a line, usually in italics, you'll see a moral of the story. And those morals are usually quite obvious. They're universal, so they could be pertain to anybody, anywhere. And it's a life and behavioral lesson that we all should live and probably learn from if you look back in history. When you leave the message clear, uh, the interpretation of the lesson is more apt to be learned. Does that make sense? Anyway, the two fables we're going to read this week are The Two Ways to Count to 10 and The Race Between the Toad and the Donkey. The Toad and the Donkey. So, hope everybody's well here in virtual classroom world. Um, you'll be having a literature test coming up probably next week. Uh, Hope you come to my Zoom meeting for social studies, which I believe I sent to you guys because you do have a Chapter 8 test. I wish you guys all the best. And remember, there is a open office hour tomorrow at 9:30. And welcome back to school. And God bless you all. Stay real.